Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We're just getting a briefing from a senior Whitehall source that said that Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber in Manchester who blew himself up, was one of a larger pool of what's called former subjects of interest whose risk remains subject to review by MI5 and other security institutions. It was pointed out that MI5 is managing around 500 active investigations at any one time, involving some 3,000 subjects of interest at any one time, which I think gives us an idea of the scale of the challenge that faces our security services at a time like this. So what can politicians do to try and prevent attacks like the one we saw in Manchester on Monday night? We've seen what UKIP has had to offer, but let's take a look at what some of the other political party manifestos have to say about counter-terrorism policy. The Conservative Party says that if it's re-elected, it would set up a commission for countering extremism, which they say would identify examples of extremism and expose them. They would also consider creating new criminal offences to try and help police and prosecutors tackle extremists. And they would create a new national infrastructure police force to protect key strategic locations across the country, like railway stations and nuclear power sites. As for Labour, they would carry out a review of the anti-radicalisation prevent programme to address the concern that it can, in their words, quote, alienate minority communities. Labour would also bring in new judicial oversight of the investigatory powers used by the authorities. And an incoming Labour government would recruit an extra 10,000 police officers across England and Wales. The Liberal Democrats would scrap the prevent programme, replace it with a scheme more focused on what they call community engagement. And the Lib Dems say they would roll back state surveillance powers. They say that people should be notified when they've been placed under surveillance, if, in their words, that can be done without jeopardising ongoing investigations. Excuse me. As for the SNP, we don't yet have their manifesto, but in their last one for the Scottish Parliament elections in 2016, they said that they would continue to work closely with partners in the UK and further afield to tackle extremism and terrorism. We're joined now by the director of the Right of Centre think tank Policy Exchange, Dean Godson, and Raffaello Pantucci of the security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, also known as RUSI. Welcome to both of you. From what you've seen of the party's policies on extremism and terrorism, are you impressed by any of that?
There's a lot of good stuff in there. First of all, the National Extremism Commission to keep the issue of ideology and upstream extremist views on the national agenda. Very good. The online extremism powers, the new proposed powers, are very welcome. The broader policies for national infrastructure.
What would this commission do?
Well, let's take first of all, name and shame. Put a sharp focus on those groupings that are not doing enough to combat the culture, the grievance-mongering culture, the culture of extremism, the upstream ideology of anti-British narratives. Lord Carlisle started it in his oversight of the review in 2011. It needs to be weaponised now, and this is a good way of starting it.
What do you make of what the parties are proposing?
I mean, I think I'm struck in many ways by how little there is really in the manifestos. I think Dean is right. There is some detail in the Tory one which demonstrates a certain level of thought and focus on this. But if we look at the Lib Dem and the Labour one, we can see that really they're only talking about surveillance powers and prevent without sort of engaging with the bigger issues. And in some ways, what's striking is the degree to which this has not really been a focus of the election campaign so far.
Is it not the case that the mainstream politicians are running out of ideas about how to deal with this?
Look, like cancer, the problem of extremism, violent extremism, it keeps metastasizing in new forms, new sources of it. Some pretty old sources. We've had many problems over the years with Libya, obviously, from the IRA time. We've had it problem, as we've seen with the WPC Fletcher thing. We've had problems
but those who are fighting
pro-Gaddafi people and anti-Gaddafi.
Those who are fighting cancer are coming up with amazing new ideas almost every day to tackle it. That's not the case of politicians who are trying to fight the cancer of terrorism.
Everybody's got to raise their game, but this is a sort of more complex. This is This is, shall we say, art, perhaps not science, not medical science. And if you look at past measures, take the 2011 Prevent Review, everyone said it would drive elements of Muslim communities into a corner. It didn't. We've actually had some years now where some of the most extreme manifestations of extremism have been tamped down. They're now, as you rightly say, coming back. And that's why we've got to keep ahead of the game. And that's why these measures in the manifesto, Conservative manifesto included, are particularly useful.
If the parties consulted you for advice on this, what they should have put in their manifestos, what would you have told them?
I mean, I think that there's, when you're talking about counterterrorism, in many ways you're talking about something that's very technical and involving people and the skills that are required to actually sort of go investigate and disrupt networks is a fairly sort of technical set of skills that someone who's fighting a political campaign won't necessarily be sort of well placed to sort of delve into the detail of. So I would argue that that sort of side of it, the sort of what they describe as pursue and protect and prepare side, the very sort of technical how to protect people, how to deal with investigations, is one piece which I think broadly there's a consensus that we're moving in the right direction and basically leave it to the professionals to sort of handle. And I think that's probably the right approach. The question really is the prevent part. And the prevent part is the part which is in some ways the forward-looking part. It's trying to figure out, well, how do we get ahead of the curve? How do you stop it so people don't become subjects of investigations, don't get involved in these sorts of networks, and actually steering them off that path early? And in some ways, what I would argue is that when we're looking at the prevent space, you're looking at a space that is really quite broad, that on some sides is basically about managing people who have been radicalized, who've been through investigation, maybe gone to prison, who've come out of prison, and now what do you do with them? You need to figure out something to do with them. You know that they've got some experience and everything else, which requires careful management. But then prevent also includes the way other end of the spectrum, which is much more about the community engagement piece, about trying to work with communities of young people who may be from which we've seen some individual radicals emerge. And I'd argue that sticking these together under the sort of broad umbrella of prevent might be sticking a bit too much. And it might be a question of maybe separating things out a little bit more and trying to break away the piece of the sort of softer end and putting it into a sort of non-security environment and keeping the other part, which is clearly still a security question, within that space.
John Prescott, Labour invented Prevent and introduced it, and it was a way to try and stop the spread of Islamist ideas in the Muslim community. But now your party's manifesto seems more worried about its, quote, potential to alienate minority communities. Is that fair?
Some of the signs are, when you talk within the community, they actually feel they're picking them as the enemy, and you therefore report on who you think are threatening in this game. And that has questioned the role of it. I think there's still a role for it, but to my mind, when you talk about the big issues, you don't have said the big issue that we're avoiding. To my mind, the big issue is, how do you bring all these parts together? Now, politicians, as we see in both the manifestos, say there's a reduction in the police, and when you'll see it's 1,600 armed police go missing, and you bring in 1,600 armed soldiers. Now, 20,000 police out of it means they're not able to do an effective job. The firemen's reduced, the nurses, the doctors all reduced. Now, if we could get out of the political argument, we'll do 10,000, you do 15,000, we put it in a manifesto, that's right. But if you want to really deal with this problem, we're dealing with it at the community level. Prevent was a start towards that, but unfortunately, the way it's developed, people have got critical of that. I think Andy of Manchester said when he was Home Secretary, he wasn't favourable to that. Why don't we bring it all together? All politicians come to an agreement that what the cities need to be safe and secure is the proper public services. We need to deal with the anti-terrorism. I mean, it's not mentioned in the Tories what that policy means. Perhaps we need to get down and talk about it, but I'd go further. I mean, regime change in the Middle East hasn't helped, has it? Well, in Libya, for example, Mr. Cameron went there, Mr. Blair was talking about how you can get them work, but the policy came out then to place the regime and join rebels. So what we've got is almost a religious war going out of these countries. We back one side or the other, and basically that is making it more difficult to deal with. And to go now to NATO and talk to Trump, and he goes to Saudi Arabia and said we must now have almost, like somebody's called, a kind of going back to the Crusades. I think it was it the American president who said it's crusade. There is a war going on about cultures. There's a war going on about religion. We've really got to sit down and ask ourselves, what do we do in this country? Why? Because it's no longer like with the IRA and others that they're organised bomb by groups of people. This is individual who've confined up in their minds. They've got to do something to help their people. And they do this terrible thing that's happened in Manchester. You can't justify it, but you better start thinking what's motivating it, and you've got to get into the community for that.
As of now, though, this doesn't look like a lone wolf in that case. And of course, Libya was a broken society long before David Cameron became Prime Minister, or even Tony Blair, obviously trying to bring Gaddafi in from the cold, as he did after '03. In fact, what you're looking...
But they were holding it together, not in the way you like, but they were.
Well, it was a pretty
principle, get rid of the regime.
It was a pretty
spills over here.
It was a pretty bleak way.
There.
But the thing about the Libyan community in this country is, on the basis of what they're saying, let's find out whether it's so, they're saying that their warnings were ignored. It seems that they're actually complaining that Prevent, far from being oppressive of them, that they're not being listened to.
Well, let's come back to
that's
Prevent. Whether you call it Prevent or something else or do something different, the fact is that that the job of the security services is to deal with things when Prevent has failed. How do we improve Prevent? How do we reach into the Muslim communities with the leaders of the communities to stop this sort of thing from spreading? What needs to be done?
I think one of the phrases that's interesting there is the question of leaders of communities, because we play, of course, and that was one of the problems with the policies under elements of the last Labour government. There were big disagreements, of course, between people like Hazel Blears and Jack Straw on that, about whether community leaders were the right way to behave. Why do we behave in a neo-imperialist way within our own borders, looking for community leaders to deliver Muslim communities when those leaders don't necessarily represent those Muslims?
Well, if not leaders, what do we do?
Well, because we treat them like citizens like anyone else, and we have an engagement at the grassroots. Not, as you say, we have to up our game. It's not been good enough under any government at the grassroots, but there's been a start made at the top end, and we now need to engage more closely at the grassroots with citizens, with Muslim citizens of whatever affiliation.
Let me get a final comment from you on that.
I mean, I think that, I've spoken to lots of people who are working on Prevent programs around the country, on the ground, and what always surprises me, they actually come back with very positive comments and remarks about the specific program that they've engaged in. And I think that's the thing that we always have to remember. On the ground, it does actually seem to work. There are just some very loud voices that tend to dominate the conversation publicly. And I think we have to be very careful not to get totally distracted by that and warp the entire policy, which actually in some parts does work. As I say, my point would be maybe we need to take some of those softer elements that really aren't sort of the hard end of security and find a way of shifting them out of the security space.
All right. I thank you both for being with us.
I've been